You've been told a comfortable lie about the ancient world. You've been told that tombs are places of rest, designed for spiritual transition. But the evidence buried beneath the sands of Egypt, the clay of China, and the jungles of Mexico tells a very different story. These were not resting places. They were high-security bank vaults. And the architects who built them did not rely on prayers or curses to protect their kings. They relied on physics, chemistry, and hydraulic engineering. We are talking about industrial-grade security systems, rivers of liquid mercury that are still toxic after 2,000 years, gravity-fed stone blocks weighing 60 tons that drop with the precision of a guillotine, biological agents sealed in jars, waiting for the first breath of a grave robber. History books call these curses. Hollywood calls them magic. But when a mechanism triggers a crossbow bolt to fire at a moving target in the dark, or when a floor collapses into a pit of spikes, that is not magic. That is a machine. The ancients didn't just build monuments. They built weapon systems that are still active today. And in this video, we are going to open the doors that were never meant to be opened. Story 1, the Mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, the auto crossbows. We begin in 1974 with a discovery that changed archaeology forever, the terracotta army. But what the farmers found that day was merely the decoy. The real secret lies a mile to the west, under a massive, unexcavated earth mound. This is the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. And according to the ancient historian Sima Qian, writing a century after the emperor's death, the tomb is not just a grave. It is a mechanical death trap. Sima Qian wrote that artisans were ordered to construct crossbows triggered by mechanisms. Anyone who dared to enter would be shot automatically. For decades, modern historians dismissed this as a myth. Automatic weapons in 210 BC? Impossible. They claimed the trigger mechanisms would have rotted away, the bowstrings would have snapped, and the bronze triggers would have corroded into dust centuries ago. But then, we examined the weapons held by the terracotta soldiers. The bronze swords and arrowheads were still sharp. They were shiny. They had not rusted. Why? Because the Qin dynasty metallurgists had coated them in a 10-micron layer of chromium oxide. This is a rust-proofing technology that wasn't patented in the West until 1937. If they could chemically preserve metal for 2,000 years, they could preserve mechanical trigger. The myth of the auto crossbow isn't a story. It's a warning label. The chromium coating means the firing mechanisms inside that central tomb could still be functional. The Chinese government has refused to excavate the central chamber. They say it is to protect the artifacts from air exposure. But perhaps there is another reason. Perhaps the ground-penetrating radar shows something they're afraid to trigger. We are standing outside the largest booby trap in human history, and the safety catch is still off. But if the Chinese relied on mechanical triggers, the Egyptians relied on something much simpler and much heavier. Story 2, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the gravity machine. If the Chinese relied on complex triggers, the Egyptians relied on something far more reliable, gravity. Deep inside the Great Pyramid of Giza lies a security system so massive, so brutal in its simplicity, that it wasn't defeated for 3,000 years. It wasn't hidden. It was built into the architecture itself. We are talking about the portcullis system. In the antechamber leading to the king's chamber, the architect designed 3 massive slabs of granite. Each block weighed up to 2.5 tons. They were suspended in grooves carved into the limestone walls, held up by thick ropes or wooden props. This wasn't just a heavy door. It was a guillotine. Once the funeral was over and the priest left the chamber, the props were knocked out. Gravity took over. The 3 granite slabs crashed down in sequence, sealing the passage with 7.5 tons of rock. But the designers knew robbers would just tunnel around the limestone. So they backed up the portcullis with a second line of defense. The plug blocks. At the bottom of the ascending passage, 3 huge granite plugs were stored. When the portcullis fell, these plugs were released to slide down the 26-degree slope, slamming into place and blocking the only way up. Archaeologists like to call this primitive, but think about the engineering. They had to cut granite, a stone almost as hard as diamond, with copper tools to a tolerance of 1/100 of an inch. so the blocks would slide perfectly without jamming. If the friction coefficient was wrong, the trap would fail. If the angle was off by a degree, the blocks would stick. It didn't fail. When the Caliph of Mamun finally broke into the pyramid in 820 AD, his workmen found the plug blocks still firmly in place. They couldn't move them. They couldn't lift them. They had to heat the granite with fire and douse it with vinegar just to crack it enough to tunnel around it. The system worked perfectly for 3 millennia. The only reason we got in was because we brought dynamite. But if the Egyptians used gravity to crush you, the Mayans used chemistry to poison you. Story 3. The Red Queen of Palenque, the chemical weapon. In 1994, Mexican archaeologist Arnaldo Gonzalez Cruz broke into a sealed chamber inside Temple 13 in Palenque. He was expecting gold. He was expecting jade. What he found was a crime scene. Inside the limestone sarcophagus lay the skeleton of a noblewoman, completely covered in a thick layer of bright red powder. It wasn't just on her bones. It coated the jade mask, the walls of the coffin, and the floor. The archaeologists called her the Red Queen. They marveled at the ritual significance. They wrote papers about how the red pigment symbolized blood, life, and rebirth in Mayan cosmology. But they missed the most important detail. That powder wasn't just paint. It was cinnabar, mercury sulfide. Cinnabar is a highly toxic ore of mercury. When you grind it into a fine dust, as the Mayans did here, you are creating an aerosolized neurotoxin. Think about the design. The moment a grave robber pries open that heavy stone lid, the change in air pressure and the physical movement kicks up the dust. It hangs in the stagnant air of the small chamber. The intruder takes a breath. The mercury enters the lungs and passes into bloodstream. It doesn't kill you instantly like a falling rock. It destroys you slowly. It attacks the nervous system. Tremors, hallucinations, madness, and eventually a painful death. The curse of the Red Queen wasn't magic. It was heavy metal poisoning. The Mayans knew exactly what cinnabar did to human body. They mined it. They processed it. By coating the queen's remains in pounds of this toxic dust, they ensured that anyone who desecrated her rest would carry the mark of death in their blood for the rest of their short life. We treat this tomb as a sacred site. We should be treating it as a hazmat zone. But if the Mayans used poison to protect their dead, the Egyptians returned to physics, with a trap designed to break the human body in the dark. Story 4. The Tomb of Amenhotep III, the Deception Pit. If the Mayans used poison, the architects of Amenhotep III used psychology. They built a trap that relied on the greed and speed of the intruder. Deep within the West Valley of the Kings, Tomb WV-22 descends into bedrock. The corridors are steep. They are smooth. They are designed to make you move fast. And then the floor simply disappears. Archaeologists call this feature the well shaft. It is a vertical drop, roughly 20 feet deep, cutting across the entire width of the corridor. In the pitch black of a tomb raid, holding a torch in one hand and a weapon in the other, you wouldn't see the edge until your foot was already in the air. The fall would break your legs, if not your neck. But the genius of the trap isn't the fall. It is the deception. On the far side of the pit, the wall is painted with intricate murals of the gods welcoming the pharaoh. To a robber, this looks like the entrance to the burial chamber. It is a lie. That wall is solid bedrock. The real entrance to the burial chamber was hidden inside the pit itself, filled with rubble and plastered over to look like the floor. The painted wall was a decoy, designed to make intruders focus their attention forward, right as they fell downward. For a century, Egyptologists have argued that these shafts were ritual passages to the underworld, or, even more laughably, drainage systems to protect the tomb from flash floods. Think about that. They believe the pharaoh spent years carving a precision-engineered, room-sized shaft deep underground, just in case it rained in the desert? No, this is tactical geometry. It is a kinetic trap designed to break the body of the first man through the door and force his accomplices to stop cold. It wasn't designed to catch water. It was designed to catch bodies. But if the Egyptians used pits to stop you, the Han dynasty used fire to incinerate you. Story 5. The Mwangwi Han tombs, the gas trap. If the Egyptians broke your legs, the Han Dynasty broke the very air you breathe. In 1971, workers digging an air raid shelter in Changsha, China, struck something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't rock. It was a pocket of high-pressure gas. When they drilled into the tomb of the Marquis of Dai and his family, a jet of blue flame shot out of the borehole. The workers had ignited a massive concentration of methane trapped inside the tomb for 2 millennia. Archaeologists argue that this gas was simply a byproduct of decomposition. Rotting wood, rotting food, rotting bodies. But look at the construction. The Mwangwi tombs were sealed with layers of white clay and charcoal. Tons of it. The charcoal absorbed moisture. The clay formed an airtight seal so perfect that the Lady of Dai, Xinj, was found with her skin still soft and her joints still flexible after 2,000 years. This level of sealing was intentional, and the gas buildup was a known consequence. Whether by design or by accident, the Han architects created a pressurized bomb. Any grave robber breaking through that seal with a torch, the only light source available for thousands of years, would have been met with an immediate explosion. The methane would ignite, consuming all the oxygen in confined space. If the explosion didn't kill them, the suffocation would. This isn't just a tomb. It's a combustion chamber. The curse of the Mwangwi isn't a ghost. It is simple chemistry. Oxygen plus fuel plus heat equals death. And for 2,000 years, the tomb waited for someone to bring the heat. But if the Chinese use gas to burn you, the Moche people use gravity to crush you. Story 6. The Tomb of Lord of Sipin. The Structural Collapse. If the Mwangwi Han tombs were a gas bomb, the tomb of the Lord of Sipin was a house of cards. Deep within the Waka Rajeda pyramid complex, the Moche people of Peru devised a trap that relied on the structural integrity of the tomb itself. This wasn't about hidden blades or poisoned air. This was about load-bearing walls. When archaeologist Walter Alva discovered the undisturbed royal tomb in 1987, he realized something terrifying about the layout. The roof of the burial chamber wasn't supported by columns. It was supported by layers of adobe bricks and wooden beams that were strategically placed. Here is the genius of the trap. The Moche architects understood that grave robbers would tunnel in from the side or the top, so they designed the roof to be unstable. If you removed the wrong beam or dug through the wrong wall, the entire structure would collapse. Tons of adobe and sand would come crashing down, burying the intruder alive along with the gold they were trying to steal. It was a self-destruct mechanism. Local Icaros, grave robbers, have told stories for generations about tunnels that swallowed their friends. They speak of the Waka as if it is alive, shifting and groaning when disturbed. Archaeologists dismiss these stories as superstition or bad luck. They say the adobe simply weaken over time. But look at the precision of the brickwork. Look at the strategic placement of the load-bearing beams. This wasn't bad construction. This was weaponized construction. The Lord of Sipin didn't need guards. He slept under a ceiling that was designed to fall. But if the Moche used the roof to crush you, the Egyptians used the very sand beneath your feet to trap you forever. Story 7. The Bahariya Oasis Tombs, the Sand Hydraulics. If the Moche used the roof to crush you, the architects of the Bahariya Oasis in Egypt used the floor to bury you. In 1996, Zahi Hawass stumbled upon the Valley of the Golden Mummies. But what he found wasn't just a necropolis. It was a hydraulic marvel. Deep within the tomb of Benenshu, the priests didn't just dig a hole. They engineered a system of channels and shafts that relied on the properties of dry sand. They filled the access shafts with tons of fine, dry sand, and they placed the massive limestone blocks of the sarcophagus on top of it. Here is the mechanism. When the burial was complete, they didn't push the heavy stone lid into place. They simply opened a small plug at the bottom of the sand shaft. The sand drained out slowly, like an hourglass, and as the sand level dropped, the multi-ton stone block lowered gently into position, sealing the tomb forever. Archaeologists call this a construction technique, a clever way to lower heavy objects. But think about the reverse. If a robber tries to tunnel underneath the sarcophagus to get to the gold, or if they try to pry up the lid, they disturb the sand. The sand flows, the support shifts, and the massive stone block above them suddenly drops. This is a kinetic trap triggered by excavation. It wasn't designed to be triggered by a footstep. It was designed to be triggered by digging. The very act of robbing the tomb activates the mechanism that kills you. The curse here is magic. It is fluid dynamics. But if the Egyptians used sand to trap you, the curse of King Tutankhamun used something far smaller and far deadlier. Story 8, the Pharaoh's Curse, the biological warfare. If the Bahariya oasis used sand hydraulics, the architects of King Tutankhamun's tomb used something far more insidious. They didn't rely on physics. They relied on biology. When Howard Carter opened the sealed doorway of KV-62 in 1922, he unleashed a legend that would captivate the world. Death shall come on swift wings to him that toucheth the tomb of the pharaoh. Within a few years, Lord Carnarvon, the man who funded the expedition, was dead from an infected mosquito bite. Others followed. Pneumonia, blood poisoning, suicide. The world called it curse. Modern science calls it a coincidence. But in 1999, microbiologists got their Kramer analyzed 40 mummies and discovered something that wasn't magic. It was a dormant killer. He found high concentrations of Aspergillus flavus, a fungus that can survive for thousands of years in the dark. When disturbed, this mold releases spores into the air. If inhaled by someone with a weakened immune system, like Lord Carnarvon, it can cause severe respiratory infections and systemic poisoning. Think about the environment of a tomb. It is sealed. It is dark. It is filled with organic material. Food offerings, flowers, and bodies. It is the perfect incubator for biological agents. Did the ancient priests know about microbiology? Maybe not in the way we do, but they knew that certain tombs made people sick. They knew that bad air killed, and perhaps they encouraged it. Perhaps they sealed specific offerings inside the tomb not just for the afterlife, but to breed a guardian that you couldn't see, couldn't fight, and couldn't escape. The curse wasn't a spell. It was a biohazard. But if the Egyptians used biology to poison the air, Genghis Khan used the very landscape to erase his grave forever. Story 9, Genghis Khan's tomb, the geoengineering. If the Egyptians used biology, the architect of Genghis Khan's final resting place used something far more massive. They didn't rely on traps inside a tomb. They turned the entire landscape into a weapon of concealment. When the great Khan died in 1227, his funeral procession carried his body back to his homeland in Mongolia. Legend says that every living thing they encountered on the journey, human or animal, was slaughtered to keep the location secret. But the real engineering feat happened at the burial site. According to the secret history of the Mongols, 10,000 horses were ridden over the grave until the ground was flat. Then they planted a forest on top of it. But here's the detail that modern hydrologists find impossible to dismiss. The text claimed that the soldiers diverted a river to flow over the tomb. This is geoengineering on an industrial scale. To move a river requires dams, canals, and thousands of laborers moving millions of tons of earth. It changes the water table. It alters the local ecosystem. And it buries the tomb under a shifting, liquid barrier that no shovel can penetrate. For 800 years, adventurers and archaeologists have searched for this tomb. They have used satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and drones. They have found nothing. Why? Because they are looking for a structure. They are looking for a pyramid or a mound. Genghis Khan isn't buried in the earth. He is buried under the geography itself. The trap, here's a falling rock or a poison dart. It is the river. It is the forest. It is the mountain. To find him, you would have to dismantle nature itself. And perhaps that is exactly the point. The greatest conqueror in history didn't want a monument. He wanted to disappear. But if the Mongols use a river of water to hide their king, the first emperor of China used a river of something far deadlier to poison his. Story 10. Qin Shi Huang's core, the Mercury River. If Genghis Khan used a river of water, the first emperor of China used a river of death. We end where we began, at the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang. We talk about the crossbows in Story 1. But the crossbows were just a perimeter defense. The real weapon is inside the burial chamber itself. According to Sima Qian, the emperor's tomb contains a scale model of his empire. The ceiling mimics the night sky with pearls for stars. The floor mimics the land. And the rivers, the Yellow River and Yangtze, were simulated with flowing mercury. For centuries, historians called this symbolic. They assumed it was a metaphor for power, not literal liquid metal. But in the 1980s, scientists tested the soil samples from the mound above the tomb. The results were terrifying. The levels of mercury in the soil were 100 times higher than normal. And they weren't random. The concentration map perfectly matched the locations of the ancient waterways described in the texts. This isn't a myth. It is an industrial reality. It is estimated that the tomb contains over 100 tons of liquid mercury. This is an environmental catastrophe waiting to happen. Think about the engineering required to pump, transport, and seal that much toxic metal in 210 BC. But think about the purpose. Mercury is dense, it is heavy, and it releases highly toxic vapor. If you breach the central chamber today, you are not just entering a room. You are walking into a high-pressure atmosphere of lethal gas. The air itself is a guardian. The Chinese government has stated they will not open the core until they have the technology to contain the atmosphere. Why? Because they know the trap is still active. After 2,000 years, the first emperor is still defending his throne with a weapon of mass destruction. And this brings us to the terrifying conclusion. These aren't just tombs. They are machines.